New York City just appointed a convicted armed robber to run Rikers Island prison. He served 7 years behind bars in the 1980s for robbery. Now he's in charge of the entire jail system. The socialist mayor says this is making history. The correction officers union says this is dangerous. And Rikers is already under federal oversight for violence and chaos. This is absolutely insane. Stay with me because this gets worse. What's up, everyone? Marcus Reed here with Senate Decoded, where I break down politics without the BS. Real quick, if you want unfiltered coverage of the most controversial political appointments and decisions happening right now, hit that subscribe button. I cover the stories the mainstream media either ignores or spins. You need to see this. All right, so New York City has a new socialist mayor named Zohran Mamdani. He just took office in January 2026, and on Saturday, he appointed Stanley Richards as the commissioner of the Department of Correction. Who's Stanley Richards? A convicted armed robber who served 7 years in prison, including time at Rikers Island, the very facility he'll now oversee. Mamdani says this is making history, the first formerly incarcerated person to run NYC's jail system. But critics say this is ideological recklessness that puts correction officers and the public at risk. I'm breaking down who Stanley Richards is, why Mamdani appointed him, what the correction officers union is saying, why Rikers is already a disaster, and whether this progressive experiment will work or blow up spectacularly. Let's get into it. Let's start with who Stanley Richards actually is, because his background is central to this entire story. In the late 1980s, Stanley Richards was convicted of armed robbery. Not just robbery, armed robbery, meaning he used a weapon. He served roughly 2.5 years at Rikers Island, then an additional 4.5 years in state prison. Total, about 7 years behind bars. He was released in 1991, so we're talking about someone who was a violent offender, served serious time, and experienced the New York prison system firsthand as an inmate. After his release, Richards turned his life around. He became a prison reform advocate. He worked his way up through the system. Here's his career trajectory. He worked in various reform organizations focused on criminal justice. He became first deputy commissioner of programs and operations at the NYC Department of Correction, so he was already working inside the system before this appointment. He served as vice chair of the Board of Corrections task force to close Rikers. So Richards has been working in corrections for years. This isn't some random ex-con off the street. He's been climbing the ranks of the NYC correction system for decades. At the appointment press conference on Saturday, Mayor Mamdani said, Stanley will make history in this role as the first ever formerly incarcerated person to serve as commissioner. I will turn to Stanley as we work to build a city where justice is at the heart of our correction system. So Mamdani is explicitly framing this as a historic moment, putting someone with lived experience of incarceration in charge of the jail system. Richards himself said at the press conference, "Today we turn the page and we start a new era under Mayor Mamdani." He also rejected what he called a punishment-centered approach to incarceration and aligned himself with Mamdani's rehabilitation-focused vision. This appointment is about ideology. Mamdani is a democratic socialist, literally a member of the Democratic Socialists of America. He ran on a platform of criminal justice reform, closing Rikers Island and ending what he calls mass incarceration. By appointing a former inmate, Mamdani is sending a message. The people who've been through the system know how to fix it. We're not listening to tough-on-crime cops anymore. We're listening to people with lived experience. This is progressive criminal justice theory in action. Does being a former inmate qualify you to run the jail system? Or does it create conflicts of interest and bias toward leniency that could endanger correction officers and public safety? That's the debate. Now we need to talk about Rikers Island because the facility Richards is inheriting is an absolute disaster. Rikers Island is New York City's main jail complex. It's one of the largest jails in America. At any given time, there are about 5,000, 6,000 inmates there. It's not a prison. That's state-run for long-term sentences. It's a jail for people awaiting trial or serving short sentences. And it's been a nightmare for years. The violence problem. Rikers has been plagued by violence, both inmate on inmate and inmate on staff. Stabbings, assaults, gang activity, drug smuggling, officer attacks. Correction officers have been beaten, stabbed, and injured at alarming rates. The union has been screaming about this for years. The federal oversight, here's the big one. Rikers Island is under federal oversight because conditions have been so bad that a federal judge ruled the city has failed to fix it. Earlier this week, literally days before Richards' appointment, a federal judge appointed an outside remediation manager to oversee reforms at Rikers. Why? Because after years of federal court orders to fix the violence, staff shortages, and inhumane conditions, the city has failed to make meaningful progress. So the federal government is stepping in and saying, you can't manage your own jail. We're appointing someone to do it for you. That's humiliating. That's a massive failure of city leadership. Think about the optics here. Federal judge, NYC has failed to run Rikers safely. We're taking over. NYC mayor, great, we're appointing a convicted armed robber to run it. Do you see the problem? There's also a long-standing plan to close Rikers Island entirely and replace it with smaller borough-based jails. Former Mayor Bill de Blasio set a deadline of August 2027 to demolish Rikers, but that deadline has already been pushed back multiple times, and there's massive opposition from communities that don't want jails built in their neighborhoods. Mamdani supports closing Rikers. Richards was literally the vice chair of the task force to close Rikers. So the new corrections commissioner's job isn't just to manage the current system, it's to dismantle it and replace it with something entirely new. Rikers is also facing a massive staffing crisis. Correction officers are quitting in droves because the job is dangerous, the pay isn't great, morale is terrible, they feel unsupported by city leadership. And now the city has appointed someone who served time for armed robbery to be their boss. How do you think that's going to affect morale? So let's be clear about what Stanley Richards is walking into. A facility under federal oversight for failure to maintain safety, chronic violence against staff and inmates, a staff shortage and morale crisis, a federal remediation manager who will be watching his every move, a mandate to close the facility entirely within a year, a correction officers union that is already skeptical of him. This is not a normal appointment. This is a high-stakes, high-pressure situation with national attention. Now let's talk about how the people who actually work at Rikers, the correction officers, are responding to this appointment. The Correction Officers Benevolent Association, COBA, represents the officers who work at Rikers. Their president is Benny Bascio. After Richards' appointment, Bascio issued a statement. Here's what he said. The jails cannot and will not operate as safely as possible if the concerns of our members are brushed aside. Richards must demonstrate a commitment to putting safety and security before any political ideology. Let me translate that. We don't trust this guy. We think this is an ideological appointment that prioritizes progressive politics over the safety of our officers. Correction officers are worried that Richards will be too sympathetic to inmates and not tough enough on discipline and security. Think about it from their perspective. They're getting assaulted regularly, they're understaffed and overworked. They've been asking for stronger discipline for inmates who attack officers, and now their new boss is someone who served time for armed robbery. How are they supposed to trust that he'll prioritize their safety over inmate comfort? The political ideology. Critique. Bascio's statement specifically mentions political ideology. That's a direct shot at Mamdani's progressive approach. The union is saying, this isn't about qualifications. This is about the mayor appointing someone who agrees with his socialist vision of criminal justice reform, regardless of whether it makes the jails safer. And they have a point. Mamdani explicitly said he's appointing Richards because of his lived experience as an inmate, not because he's the most qualified corrections professional in America. Imagine you're a correction officer at Rikers. You've been getting assaulted, you're working mandatory overtime because of staff shortages, and the city just appointed a convicted armed robber to be your boss. How motivated are you going to be to stay in that job? The risk here is a mass exodus of correction officers, which would make the staff shortage even worse, which would make the facility even more dangerous. Progressives would say, the Correction Officers Union is resistant to reform. They want tough-on-crime policies that have failed for decades. We need someone with lived experience to bring real change. And there's some truth to that. Police and correction officers' unions are often the most resistant to criminal justice reform. They benefit from the status quo. But there's a difference between reform and recklessness. The big question is, will Stanley Richards actually listen to correction officers' safety concerns, or will he dismiss them as reactionary resistance to progress? If he listens and builds trust, this could work. If he doesn't, this could blow up spectacularly with a staff revolt. Now let's zoom out and talk about WHO-appointed Richards, because Mayor Zohran Mamdani is not your typical Democrat. Zohran Mamdani is a democratic socialist. He's a member of the Democratic Socialists of America, DSA, the same organization as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and other progressive politicians. He was elected NYC mayor in 2025 and took office in January 2026, so he's been in office for less than a month. Before becoming mayor, he was a New York State Assembly member representing Queens. Mamdani ran on a hard-left progressive platform. Close Rikers Island defund, or at least severely cut. The NYPD raised taxes on the wealthy universal programs, housing, healthcare, criminal justice reform focused on rehabilitation, not punishment. He's the most progressive mayor NYC has had in decades, maybe ever. The Richards appointment isn't happening in isolation. Mamdani has been making controversial appointments across the board. Earlier, he appointed another convicted armed robber to his public safety transition team. He's also signaled he wants to disband the NYPD's protest response unit. He's calling for higher taxes on the top 1% to fund social programs. This is a pattern. Mamdani is governing as a true democratic socialist, not a moderate Democrat. What Mamdani is doing in NYC is a real-time test of progressive criminal justice theory. The theory says punishment doesn't work. Rehabilitation does. People with lived experience, like former inmates, should lead reform. Jails should be smaller, more humane, focused on getting people back into society. This is the opposite of the tough-on-crime approach that dominated American politics for decades. The stakes. If Mamdani's experiment works, if crime stays low, if Rikers becomes safer, if recidivism drops, it could reshape criminal justice policy nationwide. Other cities would copy NYC. If it fails, if crime spikes, if Rikers becomes more dangerous, if correction officers revolt, it could discredit progressive criminal justice reform for a generation. Republicans are watching this. Conservative media is all over it. They're waiting for it to fail so they can say, see, progressive policies don't work. Socialism doesn't work. Democrats are also watching nervously. Moderate Democrats don't want to be associated with Mamdani if this blows up, so Stanley Richards' performance as corrections commissioner will have implications far beyond NYC. All right, let's get to the ultimate question. Will this work? Richards has been through the system. He knows what it's like to be an inmate. He understands the dehumanization, the violence, the lack of rehabilitation programs. That perspective could lead to genuine improvements in how inmates are treated. This isn't some activist off the street. Richards was already first deputy commissioner. He knows how the Department of Correction operates. He has institutional knowledge. Every previous corrections commissioner came from law enforcement or traditional corrections backgrounds. They all failed to fix Rikers. Maybe someone with a completely different background can find solutions others missed. If Richards implements better programs, education, job training, mental health services, he could actually reduce recidivism and make NYC safer long term. Can someone who served time for armed robbery be objective about discipline and security? Or will he be biased toward leniency? Correction officers are already worried that Richards will prioritize inmate comfort over officer safety. If they're right, violence could increase. If Richards is so committed to progressive ideology that he ignores practical concerns, this could fail badly. Rikers is in crisis right now. Federal oversight, violence, staff shortages. This is not the time for an experimental appointment. For this to work, Richards needs to build trust with correction officers, work with the federal remediation manager, reduce violence inside Rikers, improve staffing and morale, make progress on closing Rikers and building replacements. Do all this while maintaining public safety. That's a tall order. If this fails, violence at Rikers increases, correction officers quit in mass numbers, federal government imposes even stricter oversight, public backlash against Mamdani, political ammunition for Republicans nationwide. I think this is high risk, moderate reward. Best case, Richards brings fresh ideas, improves conditions marginally, and becomes a symbol of second chances. Worst case, Rikers gets worse, officers revolt, and this becomes a cautionary tale about ideological appointments. Most likely case, mixed results, some improvements, some failures, lots of controversy. All right, let me bring this all together. New York City's socialist mayor Zohran Mamdani just appointed Stanley Richards, a convicted armed robber who served 7 years in prison, to run the city's entire jail system, including Rikers Island. Richards is the first formerly incarcerated person to serve as NYC Corrections Commissioner. Here are the key takeaways. First, this is an ideological appointment. Mamdani is a democratic socialist implementing progressive criminal justice theory in real time. Second, Richards has extensive experience in the corrections system, but his criminal past raises questions about conflicts of interest and judgment. Third, Rikers Island is in crisis, under federal oversight, plagued by violence, facing staff shortages. This is a terrible time for an experimental appointment. Fourth, the Correction Officers Union is skeptical and worried that Richards will prioritize progressive ideology over officer safety. Fifth, this appointment will have national implications. If it works, it reshapes criminal justice. If it fails, it discredits progressive reform. So what do you think? Is this a bold move that could actually fix Rikers? Or is this reckless ideological experimentation that will make things worse? Can a convicted armed robber be trusted to run a jail system? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more coverage of controversial political appointments and progressive experiments like this, hit that subscribe button. I'm Marcus Reed with Senate Decoded, breaking down the politics everyone's talking about. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.